Good day. My name is Andrew Isaacs. I'm on the faculty of the University of California at Berkeley, where my job is to teach climate science and climate change strategies to business students. I'm a geochemist by training, and so I look at the issue of climate change through the lens of what science tells us is actually happening with our climate, and also what makes sense if we want to do something about reducing our climate impact. Today, we're going to spend a few minutes on one of the fundamental aspects of understanding our climate impact in the context of agriculture, and particularly grape growing. This is a small vineyard growing wine grapes in Napa County, California. It's early spring here, and so the vines are just coming out of dormancy. What these plants will do in the coming months is to take a considerable amount of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis. The carbon in that CO2 is what we refer to as modern carbon. Modern carbon is carbon in the form of CO2 that is already in the atmosphere. Using photosynthesis, these plants will build tissues, and ultimately wine grapes, which of course is the reason we planted this vineyard in the first place. All of the carbon that these plants will utilize, as I said, comes from the atmosphere. At the end of the growing season, after we harvest the grapes, these vines will slowly go back into dormancy. They'll drop their leaves, and in the winter, we'll prune them to get ready for the next season. Now, all of that plant material that we're talking about, the grapes, the canes, the leaves, and so on, all of that organic material is compounds made from carbon that came out of the atmosphere. And all of that plant material will also return its carbon naturally back into the atmosphere, mostly as CO2, through the process of microbial decay, and mostly during the winter months. Over the course of a year, the plants will have made no net change to the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere through the cycle of first photosynthesis and then microbial decay. There are folks who attempt to reduce their carbon emissions by, say, capturing the CO2 that's released from fermentation when you make wine grapes into wine. But basically, I would say, don't bother. The cycle of growth that I just described takes modern carbon out of the atmosphere and returns the same amount of modern carbon back into the atmosphere. That cycle of growth, looking only at the plants themselves, therefore does not have any climate impact. Nothing about that process increases the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. But farming involves a lot more than just watching plants grow and then harvesting the crop, as you know. Right now, we're in a barn on that same vineyard property. But here, we have a different kind of carbon that absolutely does have an impact on the climate. This is a very familiar setting for anyone working in farming. What surrounds me here are the things that we use to do farming operations, and many of them do impact the climate. Our main concern with the climate impact of farming operations is that those operations often add to the amount of climate warming gases in the atmosphere, such as CO2. The impact to the climate through farming practices comes in a few different ways. The most obvious way is that my tractor burns diesel fuel and my truck and other equipment burns gasoline. Both of those do add CO2 to the atmosphere and therefore add to the problem of climate change. The reason for that is that the carbon in the fuel I'm using used to be in the ground in the form of oil and gas deposits. And that carbon had been in the ground for millions of years. That's why we refer to them as fossil hydrocarbons or fossil fuels. The word fossil just means old. By using fossil fuel, we're taking carbon out of the ground and putting that carbon into the atmosphere, mostly in the form of CO2. That fossil carbon will stay in the atmosphere. It does not somehow go back into sequestration in the ground. And that fossil carbon will stay in the atmosphere for thousands of years, possibly tens of thousands of years. CO2 simply does not break down in the atmosphere. Basically, it just stays there, And since CO2 is a greenhouse gas, that accumulation of CO2 is warming the planet. Now, some amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is taken up temporarily by forest land and also by dissolving into the oceans. But this can't be relied on as a long-term sequestration practice that would save us from our emissions in the present day. In summary, activities that involve modern carbon, like growing crops, have by themselves no impact on the climate. They don't produce a change in the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere. That is not true for the use of fossil fuels, which adds to the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And it's that additional CO2 that is warming the planet. The bottom line on this? Do everything you can to reduce your use of fossil fuels if you want to reduce your contribution to the problem of climate change. Now, there are other farming practices that also add to climate change, including this stuff. This is pretty typical nitrogen fertilizer. The use of nitrogen fertilizer, either in the form of nitrate, ammonia, urea, or other fixed nitrogen compounds, adds to the problem of climate change. Here's how. Every pound of nitrogen that we add to farmland will eventually be converted by microbes into nitrous oxide, or N2O. Some of the nitrogen that we apply will wind up in the plants we're growing, of course, but even that nitrogen will sooner or later wind up as N2O in the atmosphere. Eventually, all of the nitrogen that you add to the soil will wind up in the atmosphere as N2O. Now, nitrous oxide is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide by a factor of about 300 molecule for molecule. Nitrous oxide does have a half-life in the atmosphere, fortunately, but it's a pretty long half-life, about 100 years. And just as the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is accumulating because we're taking fossil carbon out of the ground and putting it into the atmosphere as CO2, the amount of nitrous oxide in the atmosphere is also growing year by year, mainly from the use of nitrogen fertilizer on farmland. The bottom line, if we want to do something as farmers to reduce our impact on the climate, is that we should pay close attention to how much fossil fuel we're burning and try to reduce it. Similarly, we should try to reduce nitrogen fertilizer use to the bare minimum that will allow us to produce a good crop.